This is The Future Of, where experts share their vision of the future and how their work is helping shape it for the better. Hello, I'm David Carston. Where does the rapid development and take-up of generative AI tools like ChatGPT, Midjourney and DALL-E 2 leave creative artists? Will writers, painters and filmmakers rapidly lose their work and incomes, or will human creativity become more important? And what should we be teaching our students in the creative arts? In this episode, Rachel Robertson and Susanna Castleton will discuss the future for creative arts practitioners and the ways in which innovative projects can act to showcase the creative work of our human artists and writers. You can find out more about creativity and generative AI by visiting the links provided in the show notes. I guess the first thing we need to define is, and I don't know how many days we have, but what is art, first of all?
Art is a product, like it might be a visual or a written product, that's primarily to engage with our aesthetic senses and to convey a message. So I suppose I think in the writing field, where we're thinking about what is creative writing and artistic writing versus what is professional writing, the normal kind of writing that's instructional is utilitarian. It tells you what you need to do or it gives you information solely. And creative writing is about giving an aesthetic experience and pleasure. So that's how I think about it in terms of writing, even though that's a very simplified version of the answer.
Yeah. Susanna, what do you have to add?
I guess too, I'd add to that yes, it can be a physical object in space, but it also can be an experience. You know, I think of some of the most profound experiences I've had in the presence of art is actually, you know, listening to I'm thinking of an amazing experience that was held just recently at the Fremantle Biennale, where two artists made this incredible soundscape that filled the whole of the Fremantle port every time a large vessel came into or out of the port, just for 3 minutes. And that there was nothing to take away in a physical sense. There was no object to own. And yet the experience was so huge to so many people that weren't necessarily expecting to be in the presence of art that day. But there they were having this beautiful kind of sonic experience as they were walking, you know, along the South Mall. So I think art can expand beyond, you know, a framed canvas or a sculpture or a novel or a piece of music into all sorts of amazing experienes.
You've both done very well in encapsulating what art is in under 2 minutes. That was applause. Hold for applause, everybody. Well, if we are in a discussion about creativity and the role that generative AI has in creativity, we also need to understand what creativity is. Again, I'm going to throw the doors open to both of you.
Mm-hmm. So I think of creativity as something that is humanly generated, that's new and original, though sometimes it combines what we already know and think to produce something original.
Yeah, and I think too often in this conversation when we start to sort of put creativity next door to the word generative AI or the words generative AI, we somehow build this binary, and I don't necessarily think that it is one or the other. You know, I think that generative AI can be used in creative ways, but I don't think it has to be at the expense of human creativity. You know, I think the conversation is very interesting when you start to, you know, talk about what is novelty, what is creativity, and I don't think it's that AI and creativity are mutually exclusive.
We have a perspective out in the open already there, Susanna, but what I guess I'd like to know from here, and Rachel, maybe you can start us off, is, well, it's been a year since ChatGPT has really come to the fore. What are the tools available to writers, visual artists, in terms of generative AI, and how are you using it in the creative process?
Sure. So ChatGPT, which I think was released to the public in November 2022, so as you say, a year ago and a little more, has been embraced by many users very quickly. And some of those will be writers, and many of us have played around with it. The most common thing that creative writers did initially was ask ChatGPT to write a haiku, which is a very short 3-line poem, and it kind of does that okay. But yeah, so some writers have used it to do some fun things, to play around with it. Some people use it in more of their associated to their creative writing. So say you're a novelist and you're quickly asked for a summary of your plot. And so you ask ChatGPT to give you some standard phrases for summaries, things like that. So people are using it for that kind of operational kind of writing. I haven't used it to write anything creative. I write creative nonfiction primarily. And so it's very important that what I write is true, is based on truth, and also has some personal elements. So for me, ChatGPT is not something that I use as a tool particularly. But people have been using it. There's quite a few novels published that are supposedly written by ChatGPT, whatever that might mean. And some of them are pretty bad.
It is important to actually understand what generative AI is actually drawing from in terms of providing the content that you're asking for. Can you define that for us first?
Yeah, so basically ChatGPT, which is the text version of generative AI, which is the most readily available. There are other ones, of course. It basically is a large language model. So it's got a whole database of what has been written on the internet and what has been scanned and typed into it and scraped, as people say. And then when you write a sentence, so if I type in the cat sat on the, we would expect the most predictable response would be Matt. So if I actually did this once, the cat sat on the, and then I waited and entered it, and ChatGPT wrote Matt. Then it wrote, comma, and it was very comfortable. So it works on large language models, so it's the next likely word, so to speak. And that's what it's doing. It's doing really rapid search and pulling up those things. So it's not like it's actually thinking for you, but it seems like that when it replies, and it produces work very quickly.
And so it very much relies, in fact, it wholly relies on content that humans have supplied.
Yes, that's already. So for first thing, all of Wikipedia, then all of other things that were on the internet. And then people have put in novels that were available digitally. And so, yes, it has a lot of material, and we don't know exactly the quality of that material. If you say, what are plane trees and do they give you allergies, then it will give you some answers. So likely that answer might be right. We know it does what they call hallucinate, which means tell non-truths. But for something simple like that, it's probably using material that's pretty accurate, but you would always need to check it.
Well, that understanding is a very important starting point when trying to understand the wider ramifications of the use of generative AI in the creative process. Susanna, how is it being used by visual artists, and have you used it in your work?
The short answer is no. I did, however, like Rachel, plug in some prompts to ChatGPT when it first came out, this time last year, to try and get it to write an artist statement for me. And it was okay. It was all right. But then it dawned on me quite quickly that it is, as Rachel just described, simply scraping what is existing. And in terms of visual work, so I guess DALL-E is probably the best known of the platforms. And of course, it's using artworks that have been generated by humans to train the AI. So it does have its origins in pieces of work. And one of the very interesting websites that I know a lot of artists went to very early on is the Have I Been Trained website, where you can actually type in your name and see if your artworks have actually been used to train the AI. And well-known artists, living artists, you can see there's thousands of their images that are actually currently being used to train. So, of course, with anything that's free, it's not actually free, in that we are the willing donors of our work, unwilling, as some of the lawsuits will say, to be giving the AI the training tools. So And I guess from my perspective, the thing that concerns me about it is, of course, that aesthetic homogenization that occurs when, those images are being repeated and repeated and repeated. And now, I'd love to see what the same prompt that would have been plugged in a year ago would give you today, and whether it would be massively different from the one that was generated a year ago, because I think, it's learning at a rapid pace. It is, and it's only learning from the things that it's producing too. So it's an interesting space. But in terms of my own practice, no. And it's not that I'm resistant to it. It's just that I have other, concerns and desires for my own work that doesn't fit in the sort of the space that I guess AI generative art does for me.
You raise so many points, and there are so many different directions this conversation could take at this point. Which door do we take, folks? Door number 2, 3 or 4? Look, I guess immediately what I want to know is, how much does it matter that generative AI is becoming part of some artists and some writers' creative process? How much does it actually matter if you say that it is just another tool? And can you relate that to other tools that we now take for granted in the creative process that also caused a bit of a splash on introduction?
I mean, there's so many ways to approach that. Yes, when photography was first invented, we all thought it would be the end of portrait painting, and that wasn't the case. But just while I'm thinking about photography, one of the earlier news stories this year was the German photographer Boris Elgson, who was awarded the first prize in a big photography award for an AI-generated photograph. And he refused the award because he knew that he was putting in this artwork that was completely generatively created.
He fully disclosed that on entry, didn't he?
I'm not actually sure if he did, but he certainly, when he received it,
Right.
He was making a point that AI is not photography, and he refused the award. And so from my perspective, the artwork in that was the conversation that ensued, which goes back to our first point, I guess, is that, what is art? For me, the art there was actually prompting this incredibly rich conversation about, well, what is photography and what is AI-generated work? So I think that was a really interesting and provocative approach that artist took. But, artists have always used new things. I remember when David Hockney first started doing paintings with iPads. It was kind of like terrible. What is he doing? He's a painter. He uses pencils and paper and acrylic and oil. What's he doing playing with his iPad? And, fast forward for I don't know how long now, but those works are absolutely on a par with every other piece of work that he's made, and have actually been able to do things that are so immersive, so interesting. I was lucky to see a show of his at the Lightroom in London a few months ago, and it was quite remarkable to see. And he's now in his 80s, still making these beautiful works on iPads that are doing things that accompany, that go hand in hand with his practice, not are instead of or in opposition to. So I think we find that artists are great testers of new technologies, and I think we're seeing that now.
Rachel, Susanna raised the point with the example of the photography prize. And as I recall, the photographer was making the comment also that these are very hard to critique, they're hard to judge. Now, you're both educators.
Yeah.
How are you approaching, say, ChatGPT and its contribution to the creative process and to work that is submitted?
Sure. So first of all, I'll say that ChatGPT and other similar free versions of generative AI are not the whole of generative AI, but they're the ones that you and I can all use, and our students and many other people are using. There are much more sophisticated versions that are not available to the general public and being developed, and that's of interest and perhaps of concern. But going back to ChatGPT, this semester in my teaching, I asked some students to try using it public in a shared space, and we talked about it. I gave them some simulated workplace situations. I said, okay, so you're going to open a magazine, and I gave them a particular task and scenario and asked them to write some of the material and to form what they might put in the magazine, the first issue and so on, and to write something about that using GPT, and they had to show me their prompts and what the responses were, and then how they critiqued them. And we found overall, and the students said this ChatGPT is really fast at producing very average to poor work that they would not want to put their name to. So these are second-year students in a writing unit. But it was useful for generating some ideas and some frameworks. Most of them went away and then rewrote most of that, and they put up slides and shared with the larger group. And you could see they highlighted the bits they wrote and the bits that weren't theirs, and there was significant rewrites. So what that showed me was what I'd already thought about ChatGPT. It's quite limited at its skill level, if you like, but also that our students were already able to critique that and take it further. And some of them put up 2 different versions and asked the class to guess who wrote what, which was interesting. And the students didn't always get it right, which was generated by ChatGPT and which was generated by the student. But I found I was able to guess that, probably because I've been teaching and writing and reading for much longer than they have. So that was easier for me to guess which were human generated, if you like. And I was actually really interested with the way the students critiqued the results of what ChatGPT wrote. And then they went back and they checked the facts. And some of them said, I don't know where it got this from. I'm doing my research. I think it would have been quicker for me just to do the research and write it, like good old Google search kind of thing. So that was really interesting. In terms of creative pieces, short little haikus, it does fine. When you're writing something much longer, it's not very effective at the moment. And so I don't think you could enter, say, a ChatGPT written novel for a prize and win that. I mean, I've judged some prizes and, I don't think it would be strong enough. But of course, if you did loads of prompt and back and forth, maybe you would come up with something better. You would then be training ChatGPT. And so as you work with it, you train it. So we're in this interesting position. So I asked the students to think also about whether they wanted to be doing that and to think about what they were entering into it, maybe not to enter their own work. So yes, the sort of creative stuff that it produces does not fool me as being human written. Maybe a very basic first-year essay might fool me, I'm not sure, about a particular topic that I don't know anything about. Yeah.
It may already have.
Yes, if that is likely. There were certainly some alarm bells with some of my first-year students' essays, but in general, ChatGPT is probably not doing as interesting work. It's not... why we have writers is to tell stories, to create meaning in the world and to add value. And I don't think that just scraping what other people have done and not adding to it is really going to do that.
Well, look, on the flip side, we are a year in. Is it incumbent on the individual students or yourselves as educators to perhaps ready the students for a work environment that may be in the very near future or already using generative AI as a tool?
Absolutely, and that was one reason why we were playing around with it in my unit last semester, is because we already could see there was actually already a job advertised, and it was a prompt editor. That was a job for what traditionally would have been asking for a content producer or a writer, which is some of our students go out and earn a living in professional writing and content production. And there was one company advertised prompt editor. And from what I've read, we don't know where the future is, but we do know that it's likely this tool will be used by most workplaces very soon. So we were talking about that as students. I still think there's going to be need for good, strong writers, even more so perhaps, because anyone can now generate kind of average and okay text that may not be based in research and may not be well written. So people who can do great research and critical thinking and add value and write well are going to be more in demand. But absolutely, we need to train our students to think about this and to think about their role in the future.
Susanna, in a space that perhaps is not as, I guess, structured as a a workplace for a content writer, perhaps in the visual artist space. Is there a sense of fear at all about the onset of generative AI and what that could represent?
I think certainly in the visual arts. Oh, look, I think, and I'm not an expert in graphic art or digitally generated artworks. I suspect there is there, but I'm not qualified enough to speak there. But certainly within the visual arts, I think there's the conversations that have been going on around ownership, about copyright, in terms of whose work's being scraped to generate what. But I think, I was just reflecting as Rachel was talking then about kind of awards and competitions, and how do we judge what is made by the hand of the artist? And probably Australia's best known award for printmaking, which is the field that I'm in, called the Fremantle Print Award. I remember many years ago, and it was very traditional printmaking, screen printing, etching, lithography. Of many years ago, they introduced a special category which was called digital prints. And there was kind of this, everyone sucked their breath in and they went, oh my goodness, but that's not a print. It's done by a computer and a printer, and that can't be a print. And so for the first few years, there was sort of a bit of hand-wringing and a bit of tut-tutting about this. And the work was primarily about it being a digital print. We kind of lost sight of the fact that it still could have, interesting conceptual links or things that kind of had other things that made it, interesting work. And sure enough, within a couple of years, it was part of just the normal entry to the Fremantle Print Award. And now you can walk into any Fremantle Print Award and you might see 3D prints and you'll see things that are done with a photocopier, with a fax machine. I think it really did indicate that willingness to embrace and try. But for the first few years, certainly it was just all about the whiz-bang technical side of it, that I don't think they actually were particularly exciting artworks. But I think, one of the things that just dawned on me was I've got a fabulous master student called Deborah Perkins, who's, again, printmaking is her field, and she's been doing this project where she's been very interested in portraiture and reproduction, because that's what printmaking is all about. And just in the last few months, she's been putting in prompts into DALL-E 2 to ask it to produce portraits that are stone-like or look like marble. And so she's become a very good prompt editor, and has really understood the words that she uses are going to give her quite different results. But she then takes those and brings them back into the printmaking studio, which is, a wonderful studio we've got down in Building 212, that has got, very, very ancient technology in it. And she puts these images back into etching plates where she rubs in ink and rubs it back off again and puts it through a press and prints it onto these hard, beautiful pieces of rag paper, and actually makes images that were drawn from generative AI processes, but now are kind of embedded with ink and stickiness and tactility and materiality that you would normally associate with a traditional print. So I think what she's doing there is she's interested in kind of repetition and replication and multiplicity and the aura and a whole lot of theoretical things that she's actually now really pushing back into, well, what is it this generative AI can do for me? And I think that cyclic approach is really exciting.
It's very much a part of a process, a long chain of moments in that process. It is not generating the end result.
Absolutely. And I think Rachel sort of picked up on this too. It's the process of doing is what makes us function, what makes us human. And particularly as educators, that is so important. We're not just interested in the outcome at the end, but seeing those processes of drafting, if we want to use that as a term, as so important. And whether you use ChatGPT or DALL-E as part of that drafting process, great, it's a tool. Why not? And it just expands that kind of vocabulary of what sort of steps you can go through in that process of creation.
And art and writing, creative writing, are always about critique and questioning and understanding the world better. And so we don't just adopt someone else's work or random words and just say, this is mine. We think about those things. So, using generative AI as an opportunity for many of us to continue doing the kind of critique and questioning. So we're questioning things like copyright laws and intellectual property. We're questioning ideas of privacy because we have less nowadays. Ethics, environmental issues, because generative AI uses huge amounts of power, and many artists are very concerned about that. Human rights, because people are paid very little in certain countries to data entry for generative AI. There's issues of governance and systems, managing risks. All of those things are what artists question all the time. The way we do it is different, but many of us want to do that in an environment that also includes that materiality, that haptic quality.
Now, in terms of the end result too, generative AI, I'm guessing here, cannot derive meaning from the imagery or the words that you're sourcing. Is that an assumption that we can make?
Well, it depends what we mean by meaning. And if we define meaning as something that the human brain, the human body has to take, but there are different levels of what they call artificial superintelligence would actually be able to do that. But that's not the kind of technology we're talking about. It's not at that stage. And, many people who critique where we're going with this kind of development would say it's not inevitable that we continue on this path. We have choices. And so part of being an artist and a creative artist is to think about those things and engage with those discussions. So I don't think artists should sort of say, I don't touch generative AI, this is terrible, because it's part of the world, just like the land we walk on and the people we know. And so we do need to engage with that. But to consider it's not inevitable, the direction of the world. We can make an impact. We can change things, and we need to work out. So I think my answer is there's different levels of meaning, but Susanna might create a beautiful print and that has meaning for her. When I go and see it, I create the meaning that I make as a viewer. And, both of us are very interested in that kind of call and response, that interaction between forms of art.
And artists have always looked to other artists for technical, aesthetic, conceptual inspiration. This is nothing new. It's the way that we have evolved in terms of finding our own space in the world. So I think this process is simply echoing back that practice of looking to other artists and responding in your own way.
Susanna, that call and response that Rachel raises, that human response to an artwork, that's something that you have been investigating recently, haven't you?
Very much. And it was a great project that actually Rachel started a little while ago, where she invited artists, writers and some undergrad students and some postgrad students to attend exhibitions at the John Curtin Gallery and write a response. And so as a practicing artist, I was quite honoured to be asked to come and write something, because that's often a good stretch. But being able to actually then be in the presence of someone else's artwork and not write a review of it in kind of like an art, conceptual, historical context, but actually create a piece of written response to another person's artwork was a really, really engaging, and I found it a fantastic way for me as a practicing artist to actually get more engaged with the work of the artist in the gallery. And particularly the work that I responded to in one of the exhibitions was by a fantastic artist called Lindy Lee. And her work is all about matter, the materiality of the stuff. She pours metal, she burns holes in pieces of paper. It's about kind of shadow and warmth and depth and physicality. So the particular project, I guess, to respond to that was absolutely about materiality of art. And I guess when we're thinking about AI, to me, that's at the wonderful other end of the spectrum of what could be actually generatively created and pumped out on a flat piece of paper. Hers are kind of textured and pockmarked and furry and fluffy and all those things that really engage the senses when I look at a piece of work. I then had the privilege of being able to try and write that as a piece of a new creative output that could then be experienced by others in a different way. So that call and response is something that I think is super, super important in that particular project.
Yeah, and it was really fun. So we've been running this project now for 3 years called Writers Respond, and it's not just people who are already writers, but people who, like Susanna, who are artists, and people from our social media area and scholars. And I invite them into an exhibition at the John Curtin Gallery and ask them to respond quite quickly. So I usually give them 2 weeks to write something short and then come back and read it at the gallery. And the gallery really loved it because, as Jane King there said, we're getting a new audience into the readings because we're hearing writers respond to artworks. And some of the artists who've actually been in exhibitions have come to the readings, or later if we've had the work published, which much of it has, some of them have followed up and said, oh, you wrote such and such about my artwork. Can I use that in a future catalogue? So someone recently asked me, Holly Yoshida, who had another exhibition, and asked if she could use something I'd written in a future catalogue. So that was like that call back and response. I think they appreciated hearing from a different perspective what was triggered by our creative writers. And sometimes what was triggered was something really personal. Sometimes it was something that doesn't relate much to the artwork, but just picked up the colour blue, for example. And sometimes, like Susanna, particularly the artist responded to that materiality and wrote about what they thought about the practice of creating. So from the particular exhibition that with Lindy Lees, and she's a very well-known Australian artist, fantastic artist, and she came here and gave a talk, so most of us went to that. We also produced an anthology called Where the Ink Falls, which is a collection of works. And then the reading went so well, we decided to follow up with some podcasts. So we developed 3 podcasts that feature different readings from that book and also discussions around it. And one of them is around, Susanna and I asked you some questions about the materiality of art, and we all got very excited and interested. And that's something that happens when people get in a room together and start talking. And creativity is very much about bouncing off each other and off the medium. And I think that's so important when you're thinking about the future of our students and creativity generally, that we remember that there's that thing about people in a room together.
And I think on that, as Rachel just mentioned, Lindy Lee generously came over and gave an artist talk to quite a busy lecture theatre just at the same time as her show opened. And several of us very definitely responded to that artist talk, actually seeing her physically in the space, the way she stood, the way she kind of mimicked some of the physical actions that she actually had in the studio of pouring molten metal onto the floor. And she spoke about working in a foundry, and she had images of herself with the full leather sort of aprons on and gloves. And she as herself, the presence in the room was definitely something that a lot of us responded to, that then connected back to her artwork. So I guess what we're sort of getting at here was that physical human presence of both the artist and the artworks, and then us responding to it, and then reading it back in the gallery again to a new audience. So it's generative in a very different way. The human is at the centre of it.
That's right. It certainly it evolved into performance almost. Rachel, that's a discussion I think we'd all love to hear. Tell us a little bit more about that podcast.
Yes, so that podcast is called Word and Image, and it's produced by our school, and it's available on all your basic podcast platforms. And there's 3 episodes that relate to the Lindy Lee exhibition, one about art and migration, one about the materiality of art, and one about how do you work from an art to write something creative. So what generates that kind of response and how do you do that? So that's specifically around for our writing students and writers and emerging writers. So all 3 are available now, and we'd love people to go and listen to them, yes.
Show notes, folks. Look for the link in the show notes. A question came to mind for me as you were both talking about the exhibition. One of the joys of visiting an exhibition is discovering the unexpected, an artist's response to a question in society that is completely come out of left field. If I was an artist then asking questions of Dali from which to source imagery, I'm only asking questions within my own realm of experience, which in itself is limiting, isn't it, Susanna?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it will only give you what it is that you think of to ask. And so often that time of thinking and having the blank page in front of you where you actually really have to sit and wonder what it is that you're truly interested in can be the best part of the journey. And I think very often with our undergrads and even through to my postgrad students and in my own practice, I often have to say, keep your eye out for those happy accidents, the things that happen along the way, because so often they are those moments of gold or the things that will allow you to take another step or find out something that you didn't know before. So I'm very much an advocate for the find out by doing method, in that, being in a studio, actually watching, looking, being attentive to how something dries or folds or falls or drips is super, super important. And I don't know if you can preemptively ask something like DALL-E to do that for you. You possibly could. I'm not an expert in that field, but certainly in terms of that creative practice, it is very much about being attentive to those moments that can happen along the way. And again, particularly in my own practice, working in printmaking, it's quite procedural. You have to do X in order to get to Y, in order to get to Z. If you don't do that, it usually ends up in a big sticky mess. So there are certain things that you have to do, but inevitably with anything that's quite technical like that, there are little slippages, there are little moments where things go wrong, and sometimes they are the gems. A lot of the time they're just poor mistakes and you've got to fix them. But there are moments, I think, that you couldn't anticipate getting what it is that you get. And it's possibly why I like printmaking so much, is because you are often surprised when you pull that piece of paper off the etching plate or you pull that squeegee over the silk screen. Oh, that's how it's actually going to turn out. I think it's, it goes back to that idea that the outcome is part of it, but the way in which you get there, particularly from an education perspective, is super, super important.
If we're looking at generative AI as limited by the contributions that have already been made in the creative space, if we are looking at a wider discussion of the influence of art on culture and how culture is reflected in art, would it be fair to say that generative AI actually relies on the continuing contribution of human creativity in order for it to remain relevant and in order for it to avoid cannibalizing itself?
Absolutely, yes. And one of the big fears is that as people use more and more generative AI, it will do that self-cannibalization. So it will just build and build on its own material. And so you'll have a lot of stuff that's pretty poor and not referenced and so on. So as it relies on us, we have to also imagine what we're doing if we start using these technologies, and how we do it and how we respond and sometimes resist, and how we think about those ethical issues and the biases that are inherent also in generative AI. We know visually there's a bias towards white faces and white people, but also 80% of the people working in generative AI field are males, for example, men. So there are many other biases as well. And so it replicates that. So it's like replicating a top layer of superficiality that's available to be replicated again and again. And that is a concern. So the role of artists becomes more important to me.
You just reminded me then, Rachel, one of our fabulous PhD students who's just actually about to be conferred, which is always exciting, Catherine Brimblecombe-Fox. She coined the term techno-auto-vampirism, which is just great, when it was to encapsulate the increasingly bizarre and rapid trajectory of generative AI. That's her term. And her project was very much based around the electromagnetic spectrum and what it does in terms of, drones, etc. So it's a long, complicated project. But she really makes a claim for painting being a way that is absolutely devoid of any reliance on EMS or generative AI. So she's quite critical of generative AI, which is where that wonderful term techno-auto-vampirism comes from.
And we do see this growth in hobbies around making and people's passion for craft and making. That's a really big thing at the moment and has continued to be. And lots of people are doing knitting and crocheting and woodwork and so on, and doing more and more of it. And that, I think, is a response to that sort of flattening electronic availability of just about all these words and images that we don't create ourselves.
You are both experts in your fields. For those of us with perhaps not the trained eye that you both have, is there a role for attribution in this work when generative AI does play a role?
Absolutely, and I think it's really, really important. And we're already talking about it, of course, at educational institutions. And I hope that the students, when they leave us, they have very clear ideas about attribution and an understanding of if they are using and incorporating generative AI material. Just like if they were using your material or your copyright, they would attribute it and be very clear about that. So I'm thinking there are many new protocols that we're developing, and the Australian government is working on sort of ethical and other issues around generative AI. But as always, the technology is moving faster than the rest of us. So one of the great things about being an educator is that we're able to start talking to our students, and they're very responsive. They want to have a future in the workplace and as creative artists, many of them. And so they're happy to collaborate with for humans and non-human things, and generative AI might be one of their tools, just like a paintbrush might be or the computer is, but they're going to, I think, be clear about how they attribute and how they work with all of the tools that they do. And of the students that I had in second year when we were playing around with this, 1/3 had already used ChatGPT quite a lot, 1/3 had just dabbled and asked it a few things, and 1/3 had not approached it and had not wanted to until I said, well, let's do this because you'll be asked to use it in your workplace possibly.
We talk about the future and we ponder those questions that you've just raised, but what if we take it a step further? Have either of you pondered a world where AI actually takes on sentience? And we talk about humanity being an inextricable part of the creative process. Well, what if sentience starts to become inherent in AI?
Yes, that is a future. That will be an interesting one. I can't imagine it. Again, I go back to that very haptic, tactile, material response that I have to the world, whether it be feeling the warmth of the sunshine on your skin or, a hot wind as you're riding into the easterly, whatever it might be. I think that it will be a form of sentience potentially, but I don't think it will ever be a replacement for the human condition and experience.
I heard Richard King talk recently. He's a West Australian writer and he's written a book about generative AI, Here Be Monsters, it's called. And he was saying that Noam Chomsky long ago said that when Deep Blue, the computer, beat the chess master at chess, that everyone got very excited and said, oh my God, computers can play chess better than humans and all sorts of things will change in the world. And, this is a long time ago now. And Noam Chomsky said, well, it's like saying that a forklift truck can beat a weightlifter in a weightlifting competition. In other words, even intelligent, possibly, quote, sentient, unquote, AI will only have a narrow range of skills. I don't believe we will ever have something like the human brain encoded in a computer that will work in the same way. So I'm one of those people who says, don't let's use the metaphors that say that, our brains are like computers. I'll bring up my memory. It's like a computer file. That's actually wrong. And computers and generative AI won't be like humans. That's my belief. And I kind of feel good about that too.
Well, it's a brave new world. Rachel,
Yes.
Susanna, thank you so much for chatting to us today. It's been absolutely and thoroughly fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You've been listening to The Future Of, a podcast powered by Curtin University. If you've enjoyed this episode, please share it. And if you want to hear more from experts, stay up to date by subscribing to us on your favourite podcast app. Bye for now.